Am I present? I just want to make sure I'm actually presenting. I'm good.
Yeah, we can see your presentation.
All right, perfect. All right, so when I first put my proposal in, it was secondary educator approaches to cemetery-based education. And while I am still going to talk about cemetery-based education, the title shifted a little bit to a framework for cemetery-based education. A lot of times when I talk about my research, I always just like to ask people what comes to mind when they think of cemeteries. I know folks might be like busy and maybe not really on, but does anyone want to share, maybe a couple people, what comes to mind when you think about cemeteries, like normally? Any brave souls?
Yeah,
I
a
will
big
think of ghosts.
Yes, ghosts. Okay. Claudia, sorry, what'd you
Yeah,
say?
okay.
yeah, I was telling about a big space, open space where I can see a lot of graves and I don't know. I have this feeling like a lot of nature in the area sometimes.
Okay,
For
can
sure.
I
Go
have
ahead.
yeah, at least here in Portugal, we have beautiful cemeteries with a lot of artistic sculptures. So that's usually what it's in my mind when I think about it.
Awesome.
Coming, can I say
Yeah, go ahead.
something?
Yeah.
Coming from a Catholic context, such as Malta, before when I was younger, I used to be scared to go to cemeteries until I met and I interviewed a cemetery keeper, one who works there, and he told me I'm not scared because there are, when I pass here through Catholic vision, we say there are many saints resting here in this place.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it's a peaceful place.
I like it. Yes, I love all of that. And one of the big things with the work that I do is a paradigm shift to think about what else a cemetery can be used for beyond these traditional usages, which generally are something related to a grieving space, which comes attached with some of the creepiness that we might attach, or it just being like a big green space that you can use. If you're not necessarily visiting for grieving, it's still the sort of place you can kind of walk around in and have a safe path to be in. Before I get rolling, I did just want to give you a moment. I have this Padlet link. It's really just resources whenever I'm presenting that might come up in the conversation. And I'll also, before I go, I'll drop the link in the chat. But there might be some stuff on there that folks want to dive into. And also, some of what I will talk about is linked on the page as well. But I'm Dr. Hilary Van Dyke. I'm an assistant professor of education at the University of Tampa, which is in Florida in the United States. I came to this research very naturally as a lover of cemeteries, a visitor of cemeteries. Whenever I travel, I visit cemeteries. I also live right next door to two big ones that I walk my dog in and walk in myself. But this specific research focus really came about through some work I was doing in my doctoral program, and then it lended itself naturally into becoming my dissertation topic. Also, one of my pet projects related to talking about cemeteries as places of learning is a podcast called Resting Places, Learning Spaces, and it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. And it's really looking at how cemeteries and memorial spaces can be places of learning. So every episode always goes back to that conversation of education. And then if the podcast isn't necessarily about a place, it is generally in some way about death or remembrance. A little background about the framework I'm going to talk about. It really starts with my dissertation study. In 2023, I did a case study of two educators in Florida who were using cemetery spaces as places of learning. And these were historically Black cemeteries, so they're primarily really using them to teach Black history. And then I was curious about what that conversation looks like if you kind of expand beyond just teachers in general, thinking how can cemeteries be places that the community and or students can learn? And so in 2024, the study expanded to consider some other places and other roles, but still focusing on how can cemeteries be places of learning. And so ultimately, I was looking at six places. So the two from the original study, which were the two cemeteries in Florida. One is in Gulfport, Florida. One is in Tarpon Springs. Rose Cemetery and Lincoln are both historically Black cemeteries. Really, all of these are. And then the two in Atlanta, the difference with Oakland Cemetery is it's technically an integrated cemetery, but it has sections that are historically Black. And then in Louisiana, looking at Sweet Olive Cemetery and Whitney Plantation. Now, Whitney is not traditionally what we think of as a cemetery, but it very much operates as one because it's dedicated to preserving the stories of the lives of the people that live there. So everything about Whitney really makes it into a memorial space. And the data sources that primarily make up what eventually became the framework are the semi-structured interviews. And backing up a little bit, I did observations as well. I visited all the spaces. Also doing archival research, so looking into newspapers.com just to learn as much as I could about the spaces. And then had these semi-structured interviews, but the big, most important one that really is the bulk of the data set was a interview that was modeled after Springay and Truman's walking methodology, where you actually let your participant guide what you do in the space. So they were leading me on a tour of how these places are used. And ultimately, through the work of this study, this framework came about. And in this framework, we're really looking at what you can get out of and how you can make it happen when we think about cemetery-based education. So I will talk through a few things surrounding like what students can gain from being engaged in cemetery education. And then I'll show some examples of how teachers and how cemetery leaders can make this happen for students. In thinking about what can be gained, one of the big things is it really allows students to foster reflection and historical empathy. The best example for this is Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. Their educational tour is literally focused on, I'm quoting from their education director, it's literally focused on fostering empathy and trying to educate the whole child. So they're really intentional and not just focusing on content. So for example, the educators, which is what they call their tour guides, set the intention of the tour before they even start. So they bring the students into a church building on the campus. They make sure the students know that this is sacred ground that they're walking on. They then take them to what's called the Wall of Honor, which on one side of the wall are the names, birth dates, jobs, and quotes from enslaved people who were brought here from Africa on the transatlantic slave trade. And then on the other side of it are enslaved people who were born in the United States at the plantation. So it's the two types of enslaved people that ended up at the plantation over time. And then in doing that, they're really showing students that enslaved people were real life human beings who really existed, not just this like abstract idea in a history book. Furthermore, when you're at Whitney Plantation, you also do on-site things like visiting a slave cabin, a jail, a kitchen, and they take students through a lot of questions to help them really think about what it would have been like to live in these times. And then when it's over, they bring the students back to the church and ask them what they learned about, what misconceptions they've cleared up, what questions they still have. And so even there at the end, they're bringing them back to a closing reflection. Another thing that they get from participating in cemetery-based education is the potential that they can really understand localized histories and narratives. For this, Oakland and Southview cemeteries are just really great examples of how teachers can use these cemeteries to tell stories, not just of community leaders, but also of everyday people who contributed to local history. Students can learn about Black professionals who, despite segregation, were resilient and even thrived. The stories included a wide range of people from post-emancipation, such as doctors, ministers, business people, teachers, and more. And then also they learn a lot about people who started a business or fought against the system in some way to make change happen. They also can learn about people who founded organizations, hospitals, pharmacies, colleges, churches, and more. But I think these two cemeteries are great examples of this idea of localized history because some of the places are still in existence that the cemetery's residents founded. So, like Morris Brown, Spelman, and Morehouse colleges, all are still very popular schools. But then also in walking among the graves of these two cemeteries, they're going to see lots of names that are named after streets and buildings that they know. And then the last thing they can really get, well, I'm sure there's lots of things, but as far as this conversation, one of the big things that they'll get from being engaged in cemetery-based education is this idea that we can confront historical misconceptions. Many students have these preconceived notions about slavery, Reconstruction, and Black life in America throughout history, and a lot of it is shaped by popular media or romanticized portrayals of what life was like by then, or just this idea that our history curriculum is very reductive and gives pretty shallow treatment or not a deep enough treatment about really what was happening here at that time. And so again, Whitney Plantation keeps coming up as a great example because when you think about plantations in general, a lot of times plantation tourism really romanticizes and makes it just focuses on the beauty of the buildings and all this sort of stuff. Whereas Whitney is very intentional in making sure students understand the brutality of what was happening there and the reality of enslaved people's lives. So their teaching method is truth. So, in considering what they gain, these are lofty ideas, but we really need to look at some particular practices that can help make this happen. And so, the other part of the cemetery, or sorry, the other part of the framework is looking at how we can make cemetery-based education happen. The big first thing is making students comfortable. Folks might not see cemeteries as places of learning. Even in this group, we, talked about it being maybe a little creepy, thinking about ghosts and things like that. And there's just lots of superstitions across culture around cemeteries. And so it is important to help students develop a positive connection to the cemetery. The best example I have of this is the teacher who worked with Lincoln Cemetery in Gulfport. She had a lot of cultural superstitions she had to help her students work through. And one thing she would do is they would actually, when they got to the entrance of the cemetery, they would say an ode to kind of ask the buried for permission to come in and work and explain that what we're doing is to bring more awareness to this space. And in creating that practice, the students felt more comfortable entering the cemetery to work. Also, using student-led teaching and learning structures. I'm going to again talk more about the work that was happening at Lincoln because this teacher is such a great example of this. And I think because she had lots of years to do that work, but at the end of every single semester, her students had some sort of huge like project that they were involved in that added to the community's cultural capital. But the big thing with it is these activities were all student led. So all the research, all the work, all the planning was very much led by the students. So for example, one cohort of her students published a book and had a book signing event. They've had, I think, two runs of the book that have all sold out. Another cohort of her students published a children's book. Another cohort of her of her students developed a walking tour, which I'll talk more about later. And then also just using available resources in the community. And for this, if you're a teacher, this is going out into the community and actually connecting with different organizations to make the work happen. But then on the other side of things, if you're looking at like a Whitney plantation, they might have all these great resources, but how are they making sure folks come and learn about it? So they also at the time of working on this study, they'd held a teacher open house to help teachers come in and not only learn more about slavery, but also realize that this is a field trip they could bring their students on that's also tied to instructional standards.
3 more
More,
minutes, Hillary.
okay.
Sorry.
Oh, you're good. I'm here at the end, so it's perfect timing. Also, another thing in making sure that it's happening is telling more complete histories. In the article, I dig into Dr. LeGarrette King's Black Historical Consciousness Framework and just analyze how wide-ranging the Black history discussion was, because a lot of times in social studies, we're just looking at victimhood stories. And so these different places really expand that to just show the complete humanity of Black folks, like love, et cetera, et cetera. Also using primary sources, which is a huge thing in social studies, just making sure students are getting their hands on things like maps, images, documents, etc. And now I'm rushing because I'm at the end. And then also developing tours. While this one mostly is focused on what cemeteries can do to bring folks in, I give lots of examples of how these different spaces have tours. But the other thing I'll say is in the case of Lincoln Cemetery, that teacher students actually developed a tour where they made literal plaques that are throughout the cemetery that you can go and do like a self-guided tour. So what I'll say is these spaces are not only places of remembrance, but they're also powerful sites of learning. Cemeteries bring history to life, challenge dominant narratives, and engage students in meaningful ways through reflection, localized storytelling, and critical inquiry. And ultimately, these spaces provide a dynamic alternative to traditional social studies education, so they're definitely worth the effort. I think is my time up.
You have
Okay.
2 more minutes.
Oh, okay. I thought you said 3 minutes. Well,
Yeah,
with my 2 minutes, I'm
one
one
more
minute.
minute. Yeah, so you can
So,
conclude.
the big thing that I didn't get as much into as I wanted to, real quick, with primary sources, this is a combination of if you're a cemetery space, making that easily accessible, but then also if you're a teacher, bringing that into the classroom. So just like Whitney Plantation has all these resources online. Also within the space itself, there's these physical primary sources like the big house, the kitchen, the jail, etc., the slave cabins. They have memorials that all use primary sources somehow to tell a story, like the actual like enslavement records of not just the plantation, but also of the county. Anyway, so I'm gonna put this up while you ask me the questions. But basically, if any of this sounded interesting to you, there's different ways you can keep in touch just to keep learning more as I keep digging into this. This is pretty much the main focus of my research. You can find me on LinkedIn, email me, find me on Instagram or my website. Questions?
Yeah,